Rely was drowning. The moment her body struck the freezing water, a shock wave of pain shot through her. Her chest seized, her lungs burned, and for a second, her mind refused to believe what was happening. Then the weight of her soaked clothing dragged her down, yanking her toward the murky abyss below. Above, muffled through the water, she could still hear them, the distant roar of the crowd, their cheers, their laughter. Her people, the ones who had thrown her in, the ones who had sentenced her to die. She fought, limbs thrashing as she struggled to surface, but something stronger than gravity seemed to be pulling her deeper. The river was alive, its unseen currents curling around her like spectral hands, dragging her toward the bottom. Then she felt them. At first, just a shift in the water, a vibration along her skin, a ripple where there shouldn't be one. Then, the first brush. A slick, cold shape darted past her leg. Then another. Her heart slammed against her ribs. They were here, the devourers, the river's executioners. Rely didn't need to see them to know what was coming. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. The jungle people spoke of these creatures in whispers, their voices laced with fear. The villagers called them the cursed ones, the river's judgment upon the wicked. Her muscles locked, terror strangling her lungs even more than the water. She had seconds. The first attack was always the worst. They didn't kill instantly. They swarmed. They ripped and tore in frenzied waves, drawn by the scent of fear, the sound of thrashing limbs. The pain was supposed to be unbearable. A human, or anything living, would last maybe half a minute before the creatures reduced them to nothing but bone. Something slashed past her arm. A flash of pale, boneless flesh, moving too fast to see. Then another. They were circling her. Relay's lungs burned, her vision hazy with the lack of air. This was it. Then something hit the water above her. A dull splash. Something heavy. Her mind barely registered it before everything shifted. The creatures turned. In an instant, the swarm that had been closing in on her broke apart, twisting toward the disturbance. Rely barely had time to register what had happened before a hand seized her wrist. The grip was iron-hard, unyielding, dragging her upward in a brutal, forceful motion. The world spun as she was yanked toward the light, her vision swimming from lack of oxygen. Her body ached, her thoughts sluggish, but she didn't fight it, because anything was better than being left down there. A second later, she breached the surface. Air. She choked, sucking in a desperate, ragged breath as the world blazed back into focus. The cold burned her throat, but she didn't care. She was alive. Then she saw them. The piranhas had turned on something else. Just a few feet away, the corpse of another fallen villager thrashed violently, the river boiling around it as the creatures tore into it with horrifying speed. They were everywhere, a writhing, snapping mass of scale bodies, gaping mouths lined with dagger-like teeth, ripping flesh from bone in seconds. The water churned red, the body jerking as if still alive, but it wasn't. It was just the force of the swarm. The sight should have turned her stomach, but she felt only cold, detached horror. That was supposed to be her. She barely had time to think before she was being dragged again. The hand on her wrist pulled her toward the shore, forcing her forward through the current. Her muscles ached, but she kicked weakly, barely helping as they pushed toward land. The man holding her was strong. His grip never wavered, his strokes powerful and precise. A gunshot rang out from the shore. "Kill them both," someone shouted. Another shot splintered the water beside them. The villagers had realized what was happening. Rely coughed, trying to keep herself afloat, her mind still sluggish from near drowning. She turned her head, finally seeing her rescuer clearly. A human. She sucked in a breath. Tan skin, dark eyes, wet hair plastered against his forehead. Rugged, scarred, battle-worn. Not one of her kind. Not one of them. Why? Why would a human do this? She had no time to ask. Another bullet struck the water just inches away. The piranhas, momentarily distracted, began to shift. The fresh corpse was running out of meat. And now they smelled new prey. The first one turned. Then another. Relay's pulse slammed against her skull. "They're coming back." The man cursed. He didn't hesitate. He yanked her arm harder, pushing them toward the shallows with renewed force. Relai's legs scraped against rocks, her feet touching solid ground. The second they reached waist-deep water, the man threw her forward. She hit the shore hard, hands sinking into the mud. Her body shook violently, her limbs weak and useless. She rolled on her side, coughing up water, barely able to process what had just happened. A second later, the human crashed onto the shore beside her, his breathing just as ragged. They had made it, but the jungle was silent again. Relai's vision swam as she looked up. The villagers were staring. No one spoke. No one cheered. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be dead. And yet, here she was. Alive. Saved. By a human. Her entire body tensed. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through the silence. Kill them both. The words spread like wildfire. Murmurs turned to shouts. The first person stepped forward, then another. Hands reached for weapons. Relai's breath hitched. The human beside her shifted, his muscles coiling like a predator ready to strike. He met her eyes for just a second. His expression was unreadable. Then he grabbed her hand, and they ran. Relai could barely feel her legs. Her lungs burned, her breath ragged as she sprinted through the dense jungle, the human's grip like an iron shackle around her wrist. Her mind was still catching up to the fact that she was alive, still processing the shock of survival, when the first arrow sliced past her ear. A sharp whistle, a thunk as it embedded itself in a tree trunk inches from her face. She flinched, but he didn't stop running. Faster, he growled, his voice low, urgent. He barely sounded out of breath. The shouts behind them grew louder. The villagers had given up their shock. Now they were hunting. Another arrow, then a spear, heavy and primitive, missing them by mere inches. Relai's pulse roared in her ears. She stumbled over a tangle of roots, nearly pitching forward, but the human yanked her upright without breaking stride. Move! His voice was sharp and patient. She bit down the surge of frustration. He acted like this was easy, like she wasn't fighting against exhaustion, against everything that had happened, against the fact that she had just been thrown to her death by people she had once trusted. Another spear hit the ground behind them. This wasn't the time for arguments. Her bare feet slammed against damp earth, her breath coming in short gasps as they wove through the thick jungle undergrowth. The trees were massive, their roots twisting like skeletal fingers, the canopy above so dense that even midday felt like twilight. She didn't recognize this part of the jungle. She had never been allowed to stray this far from the village. Only the exiled did, or those who didn't plan on coming back. The human veered suddenly, dragging her toward a narrow path between two enormous, moss-covered boulders. The ground dipped beneath them, the soil growing wetter, muddier. We can't outrun them forever, Relai panted. We don't need to, he muttered. Before she could ask what that meant, he pulled her down behind the massive root of a fallen tree, his body tense. Listening, watching, Relai pressed herself against the damp bark, trying to still her frantic breathing. Her pulse felt deafening. Footsteps, shuffling through the undergrowth. The villagers weren't far behind. She heard them, low voices, panting breaths, the unmistakable clatter of weapons. They were speaking in hushed tones, their words laced with urgency. She cannot be allowed to live. Did you see what happened? The curse protected her. She is unholy, and the human, he is marked now too. Relai clenched her jaw, her fingers digging into the mud beneath her. Curse. That was all she had ever been to them. Not a person, not a woman, just a curse to be cast out, thrown into the river like rotting food. The human beside her shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on the knife at his belt. A soldier's reflex. His dark eyes flicked toward her for a fraction of a second, just enough to gauge her reaction. She stared ahead, her breathing slow, controlled. The villagers moved closer. She could see their shapes now through the dense leaves. 5, maybe 6 men, all armed. They weren't skilled hunters, but they didn't need to be. They had numbers. The human moved first. Fast, silent, lethal. Before she could even register his intent, he was on the closest villager. one hand clamped over the man's mouth, the other driving his knife into his ribs. A strangled gasp, a shuddering breath. Then silence. The human eased the body down without a sound. Relai's stomach twisted, but she didn't flinch. She had seen death before. One of the other villagers turned, brow furrowing. Carrie, the human was already moving. He lunged, knife flashing. This time, the kill wasn't silent. The dying man let out a short, garbled cry. Too loud. The others whirled. Relai didn't think, she acted. The closest villager raised his spear. She slammed her fist into his throat. He choked, staggering back. Her body moved on instinct, fluid and sharp, years of suppressed anger boiling to the surface. Another attacker lunged at her, but she was faster. She ducked, grabbed a fallen branch, and drove it into his stomach. The human, meanwhile, was a force of nature. He moved like someone who had fought 1,000 battles before this one. A twist of his knife, a sharp, wet sound. Another body hit the ground. The last villager turned to flee. Relai caught a glimpse of his face, Narrows. She knew him. He had played with her as a child. He had laughed when she was thrown into the river. And now, he was running. Relai inhaled sharply, fingers tightening around the branch in her hands. The human beside her tensed. He was waiting for her to decide. Let him live or end it. Her breath came hard and fast. She let him run. The jungle swallowed him whole. Silence fell. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves, the faint echo of a man who had once called her a friend fleeing into the dark. Relai exhaled, suddenly aware of how tightly she had been holding herself. The human wiped his blade against his sleeve, his voice dry. Not bad. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Her body still shook, but it wasn't from fear. You killed them, she said quietly. He didn't blink. They were going to kill you. A beat of silence. You didn't hesitate. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smirk. Neither did you. She looked away. Her fingers curled, then released. Her entire life, she had been told she was weak. A burden. Something to be cast away. Now, she had fought back, and it felt like breathing for the first time. The human sheathed his knife, his expression unreadable. We should go. More will come. Relai hesitated. Then she nodded. She didn't trust him. Not fully. Not yet. But she was still alive. And right now, he was the only reason why. Without another word, they disappeared into the jungle. The jungle was alive with sound. The distant calls of unseen creatures, the rhythmic hum of insects, the rustling of leaves in the canopy high above. But here, beneath the thick roots of an ancient tree, there was only silence. Relai sat with her back against the rough bark, her body aching from exhaustion. Her bare feet were scratched and bruised, her limbs trembling with the aftermath of too much running, too much fighting. But she was alive. That still felt strange. The human, Caden, was across from her, his back pressed against the same tree trunk. His breathing was steady but slow, controlled. His injured legs stretched out in front of him, the crude bandage around his wound already dark with blood. She had expected him to collapse the moment they stopped. Instead, he had pulled out a knife and started sharpening it, his movements methodical, almost mechanical. He had barely looked at her since they had sat down. Relai exhaled slowly, pressing her palm against the cool earth. She didn't know what to say to him. He had killed for her, without hesitation, without question, and she had fought beside him. She had never done that before, never fought for her own survival. She had always been told that she was weak, that she was something to be feared, to be cast away like an unwanted relic of a dying bloodline. But here she was, alive, because of him. She swallowed, shifting slightly. You're bleeding. Caden didn't stop sharpening the knife. I've had worse. The words were flat, but they weren't meant to be dismissive. Just a statement of fact. She studied him, really looking this time. His face was lined with old scars, subtle but deep. His arms were lean and strong, covered in faint scratches from the jungle. He didn't move like a villager or even a hunter. He moved like someone who had spent a lifetime watching his own back. What are you? She asked before she could stop herself. His dark eyes flicked up to meet hers, unreadable. A man who should have kept walking. She tensed slightly, but he didn't say it with anger. Just honesty. You regret saving me? Caden was quiet for a long moment. The blade in his hands glinted in the dim light as he turned it over between his fingers. No, he said finally, but I'm not sure I made the smart choice. Something inside her twisted. She looked away, staring at the dark soil beneath them. I wouldn't have saved me either, she murmured. That made him pause. He didn't say anything right away, and for some reason, that made the silence heavier. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he asked, "They called you cursed." She let out a bitter breath. Yes. He watched her waiting. She had never told anyone the truth before. Not that anyone had ever asked. She flexed her fingers against her knees. I was born with a mark on my skin, a symbol from an old prophecy, one that says my blood will bring ruin. She let out a soft, humorless laugh. They say the land rejects me, that even the gods refuse to claim me. Caden studied her carefully. His gaze flicked down to her exposed arm, to the faint violet markings that ran along her forearm, shimmering slightly in the dim light. That why they threw you in the river? She nodded. He scoffed quietly. Idiots. Rely blinked. You don't believe in curses? I believe in people being stupid. He set the knife down and leaned back against the tree. I've seen enough to know that fear makes people do cruel things. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery. There was none. He was telling the truth. Her fingers curled slightly. Why are you here? Caden exhaled through his nose. Got stuck here. Was supposed to get picked up, but that didn't happen. She frowned. Why? Because people like me don't get clean exits. Rely tilted her head slightly. Like you. He hesitated for a moment, then rolled up the torn fabric around his leg, revealing something beneath the dried blood. A brand. Faint, but unmistakable. A mark burned into his skin. It wasn't from her world, but she knew what it was. You were a soldier. He didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't have to. Something about that unsettled her. She had heard stories of human wars, of mercenaries who fought not for honor, but for profit. Killers without loyalty, without mercy. And yet, he had saved her. I don't trust mercenaries, she said before she could stop herself. He let out a soft, dry chuckle. Good. That means you're not stupid. A beat of silence. She should have been more afraid of him. He had killed without hesitation, without remorse. He had survived in this jungle alone for who knew how long. But she wasn't afraid. She wasn't sure what she felt. Her gaze flicked to his wound again. The makeshift bandage was damp with blood. He was hurt worse than he let on. Let me see it, she said. Caden shook his head. It's fine. It's not. He gave her a sharp look, as if expecting her to back down. She didn't. With a low sigh, he leaned back against the tree, stretching out his leg. Fine. Make it quick. Rely hesitated for only a moment before shifting closer. The air between them felt smaller now, the space charged with something she didn't fully understand. She reached out, her fingertips brushing his skin as she carefully unwrapped the bandage. He didn't flinch, but she felt the tension in him, the way his body remained unnaturally still. She pressed her palm just above the wound, feeling the heat of his skin beneath her own. For the first time, he looked at her, not just in passing, not just to gauge a threat. Really looked. His eyes were darker up close, flecked with something unreadable, something deeper. Her breath caught. His did too. The moment stretched, slow and heavy. Rely swallowed, suddenly all too aware of how close they were, of the heat radiating between them, of the way her fingers lingered against his skin longer than necessary. She should move. She should say something. But neither of them did. A distant sound broke the moment. A branch snapping somewhere deep in the jungle. Caden exhaled sharply, his gaze flicking away. Get some rest, he muttered. She nodded slowly, pulling back. The warmth of his skin still lingered on her fingertips. She lay down against the tree roots, exhaustion finally pulling at her bones. But even as sleep crept in, her mind stayed on him. On his hands. On the way he had looked at her, on the fact that for the first time in her life, someone had fought for her and didn't think she was cursed. and that terrified her more than anything else. The jungle was restless that night. The thick canopy above swayed with unseen movement, the whisper of leaves blending with the distant calls of predators hunting in the dark. A storm was coming. R'lyeh could feel it in the heavy, humid air pressing against her skin. The fire between them flickered weakly, its glow casting long shadows against the damp earth. It was small, barely enough to keep the cold at bay, but neither of them wanted to risk drawing attention. Caden sat across from her, sharpening his knife in slow, rhythmic strokes. The blade gleamed under the firelight, each movement steady, precise. He was like that in everything he did, controlled, measured, as if he carried an unspoken rule that nothing in his world could be left to chance. R'lyeh watched him, absently running her fingers over her arms, tracing the faint violet markings along her skin. She had spent her entire life being told she was cursed, untouchable. But this man, this human, had grabbed her hand without hesitation, had fought for her, had killed for her. She still didn't understand why. Her gaze drifted to his wounded leg. The bandage was holding, but she could tell it was slowing him down. He wouldn't admit it. He never admitted anything, but she saw the way his jaw tightened when he moved. "You should rest," she said. Caden didn't look up. "So should you." She exhaled through her nose. Stubborn. He was impossibly stubborn. Another gust of wind sent a shudder through the trees. The jungle was getting colder. R'lyeh hesitated, then shifted closer to the fire, stretching her hands toward the weak warmth. "You never said why you saved me," she murmured. Caden finally paused, his grip tightening on the knife. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, without looking at her, he said, "I don't know." A strange answer. Too honest. R'lyeh turned her gaze toward the flames, watching the embers crackle and shift. "You could have left me in that river. Let them finish what they started. I could have." She looked at him again, studying the sharp lines of his face. He didn't blink, didn't waver. "But you didn't," she pressed. Caden sighed, setting the knife down. His fingers flexed slightly, as if he wasn't used to being asked these kind of questions. "I've seen a lot of things," he admitted. "Good people, bad people, the ones in between." He met her gaze then, something unreadable flickering behind his dark eyes. "And I know when someone doesn't deserve to die." R'lyeh swallowed. No one had ever said that to her before. Her throat felt tight. She looked away, clenching her hands together in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. Then another gust of wind blew through the trees, colder this time. The fire wavered, barely holding on. Caden's voice broke the quiet. "Come here." She blinked, turning back to him. "What?" He exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "You're cold. Get closer." R'lyeh hesitated. She had never been this close to a human before. She had never been this close to anyone. But the cold was biting, and her body ached from exhaustion. And he was warm. Slowly, cautiously, she shifted toward him. Caden didn't move at first, but as she settled beside him, she felt the shift in his breathing. The tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly against his knee. She wasn't the only one affected by this. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the scars along his jaw, the quiet intensity in his expression. "Better?" he asked. R'lyeh nodded, though she wasn't sure if the warmth in her chest was from the fire or from him. They sat like that for a while, silent, close, listening to the jungle around them. Then, without thinking, she reached out. Just a small movement, just the barest brush of her fingers against his arm. Caden tensed. Not in alarm, not in rejection, just surprise. She pulled back slightly, but he caught her wrist, his grip firm but careful. He looked down at her, his eyes darker now, searching. R'lyeh's pulse quickened. She didn't know what she was doing. She had never done this before. But she didn't pull away. Neither did he. His fingers moved slowly, tracing over the violet markings on her wrist, the ones her people had called cursed. To him, they were just skin. Her breath hitched slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Caden's thumb brushed over her palm, slow, deliberate. "Testing. Not afraid of curses?" she whispered. His lips quirked in the faintest hint of a smirk. "I don't believe in them." Something inside her cracked. Before she could stop herself, she leaned in just slightly, her forehead barely brushing his shoulder. Caden didn't move, didn't pull away. He just let her stay there, his fingers still tracing her wrist, his breath steady, grounding. The jungle storm raged outside their small shelter, but here, with him, she felt safe. For the first time in her life. The jungle had never felt this quiet before, not even at night. Realize stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath shallow, her body tense. The usual hum of insects, the distant calls of unseen creatures, all of it was gone. Something was wrong. Caden was beside her, crouched low, scanning the trees. His hand rested near the hilt of his knife, his muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. He felt it too. Then, the first sound, a snap of a branch. Too precise, too deliberate. Not an animal. Reli's stomach clenched. They had been found. The first shot rang out before she could react. Caden grabbed her arm and yanked her down behind a fallen log, just as a blast of searing energy sliced through the air. It struck a tree behind them, burning a jagged hole straight through the trunk. Reli's heart pounded. "Ooh, mercenaries," Caden muttered. His expression was dark, unreadable. He reached for his sidearm, checking the charge. "Yours?" she asked breathlessly. He exhaled sharply, jaw tightening. "No." Another shot, then another. The mercenaries weren't blindly attacking. They were hurting them, pushing them toward an inevitable trap. "We have to move," Caden said, already scanning for an exit. His eyes flicked to the dense undergrowth ahead. There, they sprinted. The jungle blurred around them, the damp earth uneven beneath their feet. Reli's pulse roared in her ears, but she didn't slow, didn't stop. She had learned by now, hesitation meant death. Another blast ripped past them, striking the ground just inches away. Caden cursed. "They're closing in." Reli's breath came hard and fast. "Why are they after us?" "They're after you," he corrected. "And me? I'm just in the way." Her chest tightened. "My people. Paid them." His voice was clipped, furious. "Your village put a bounty on your head." Something inside her cracked. Her own people. She had been thrown into the river, cast out like she was nothing, and that should have been the end of it. But they wanted to make sure she never came back. She should have felt broken. Instead, all she felt was rage. A dark, deep-rooted anger that had been buried inside her for too long. Another blast. Closer. Caden grabbed her hand, yanking her into the shadows of a massive tree root. They ducked low, pressed close. Rely could hear the mercenaries now. Moving, closing in, voices sharp and focused. "They're spreading out," Caden whispered. She swallowed. "How many?" "At least 6. Reli's hands curled into fists. They were trapped. They couldn't outrun them. Caden must have realized it at the same time, because he exhaled slowly. "We make a stand." She looked up at him, searching his face. He wasn't afraid. He should have been, but he wasn't. "Do you trust me?" he asked suddenly. Reli's pulse jumped. She should have hesitated. She should have questioned it. But she didn't. She nodded. "Yes." His grip on her hand tightened for a fraction of a second. Then he pulled a small device from his belt, a compact explosive. "Cover your ears," he said. She barely had time to react before he threw it. A blinding flash. A concussive blast that sent the jungle trembling. Shouts. Chaos. Caden moved first. He lunged from their hiding spot, his knife flashing in the dim light. Rely didn't think. She followed. The first mercenary barely had time to turn before Caden drove his blade into his throat. A gurgled choke, a body hitting the ground. Another turned his rifle toward them. Rely moved on instinct. She slammed a rock into the man's temple before he could fire. He crumpled, unconscious. The third mercenary fired wildly. Caden shoved her down, taking the brunt of the blast to his shoulder. He staggered, but he didn't fall, didn't stop. Reli's breath hitched. "Caden." "I'm fine," he ground out. Blood was soaking into his sleeve, but his grip on his weapon was still firm. The last mercenary lunged toward him. Before Rely could think, she grabbed the fallen rifle and fired. The shot wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. The mercenary collapsed. Silence. Rely's hands were shaking. She had never killed before. Her breath came in ragged, uneven bursts, her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. Then she felt Caden's hand on hers. Warm, solid, steady. You did what you had to, he murmured. She looked up at him, her vision swimming. He was bleeding. She had almost lost him. She didn't think. She just moved, her arms wrapped around him, holding tight, her body pressing into his, needing to feel that he was still there. Caden exhaled sharply, surprised. His body stiffened for a moment. Then, slowly, he relaxed. His arms came around her, one hand pressing lightly against her back. Not pulling her in, not forcing, just there. Solid. Grounding. Relai's fingers curled against his shirt, her forehead resting against his shoulder. They were going to take me. His grip tightened slightly. I wasn't going to let that happen. She shivered, her body still trembling from the adrenaline. Caden pulled back just enough to look at her. His hand brushed against her cheek, his thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. It was careful, intentional. Something deep and unspoken passed between them. Relai didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was him. But suddenly, their lips were barely apart. A breath. A pause. Then, contact. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't rushed. It was slow, deliberate. A question, an answer. Relai melted into it, her fingers tangling in his shirt, pulling him closer. Caden made a quiet sound in the back of his throat, somewhere between relief and surrender. Then he was kissing her back, his other hand sliding around her waist, pulling her against him. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the jungle, not the blood on their hands, not the past. Only this, only them. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Caden rested his forehead against hers. We're not done yet, he murmured. Relai swallowed hard, nodding. I know, but in that moment, she wasn't afraid. Because no matter what came next, she wasn't alone anymore. The jungle pulsed with tension. The usual sounds of life, the rustling of leaves, the distant cries of unseen creatures, had vanished. In their place was an eerie silence, the kind that came before a storm, or before a hunt. Relai crouched low behind a thick tangle of roots, gripping the stolen rifle tightly. The cool metal felt foreign in her hands, but she couldn't afford hesitation. Not now, not when they were coming. Caden knelt beside her, his face unreadable, eyes locked on the trees ahead. His breathing was steady, controlled, but she could see it. The faint stiffness in his posture, the subtle way his fingers flexed around his knife. He was preparing for war. She swallowed hard, forcing her own body to still. They'll be here soon, she whispered. Caden nodded. Let them come. Relai wasn't sure if it was madness or confidence, but she felt it too. The sharp, electric focus before battle. Fear still coiled in her chest, but beneath it was something else. Something colder. Something ready. A faint metallic click echoed through the trees. Footsteps, careful but deliberate. Then a voice low, commanding. Caden Voss. Relai stiffened. The man who spoke wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His voice carried through the dense jungle with the quiet certainty of someone who knew he was in control. Caden exhaled slowly, his expression darkening. Lorca. Relai glanced at him sharply. You know him. He didn't take his eyes off the trees. Yeah. A heavy pause. Then another voice, sharp, eager. The girl's here too, someone muttered. Relai's stomach twisted. They were after her. Her people had paid them, had sent killers to ensure she never returned. Something inside her turned ice cold. A new voice, rough and amused. Come on, Voss. You know how this goes. A shadow moved through the undergrowth. Relai barely had time to process the shape before a gunshot rang out. She flinched, her heart slamming against her ribs. The bullet missed, but just barely. It struck the tree trunk inches from Caden's head, spraying bark across his shoulder. Then, all at once, chaos. Caden moved first. Before the next shot could fire, he lunged from cover, blade flashing. The first mercenary barely had time to react before Caden drove the knife into his throat. A gurgled choke, a body hitting the ground. Relai's breath came hard and fast. No time to think. She raised a rifle and fired. The shot wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. The bullet caught a second mercenary in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Caden was already moving, taking advantage of the opening. Another kill. A roar of anger echoed through the jungle. Then came the return fire. Rely barely managed to duck before bullets ripped through the air, tearing through leaves and earth. She dropped lower, pressing herself into the damp ground as energy blasts hissed past her skin. She turned, searching for Caden, and her heart stopped. One of the mercenaries had him pinned. A massive man, stronger, heavier. He slammed Caden against a tree, the impact sending a dull crack through the air. Caden gritted his teeth, struggling, but the man pressed a forearm against his throat. His free hand reached for a gun. Rely didn't think. She moved. She surged forward, her rifle forgotten. She grabbed the nearest weapon she could, a jagged stone from the ground, and swung. The rock smashed into the mercenary's skull. He let out a sharp, pained grunt, but didn't go down. Rely swung again, harder. This time he staggered. Caden took the opening. With a feral snarl, he twisted, wrenching his knife free and plunging it into the man's ribs. The mercenary collapsed, choking. Then everything went still. Silence. Panting breaths. The smell of blood and damp earth. Rely's hands trembled. She had fought before, had killed before. But this was different. This was Caden. She had saved him, and he was looking at her like he knew it. For a moment, they just stood there, close, too close. The jungle around them blurred, the weight of what had just happened pressing against them. Caden's chest rose and fell sharply. He was still bleeding, still exhausted, but his focus was entirely on her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough. She shook her head, barely able to form words. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something raw. Then, before she could react, his hand was on her face. Gentle, warm, grounding. Rely sucked in a sharp breath. She had never been touched like this before. Not in kindness. Not in something that felt like need. She wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was her. But their lips met, sudden, desperate, real. The kiss was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't soft. It wasn't slow. It was fierce. A clash of heat and adrenaline, of fear and survival. His fingers curled against her jaw, pulling her closer. She let him, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone, and neither was he. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Caden rested his forehead against hers. Rely swallowed hard. What now? He exhaled slowly, eyes dark and certain. Now, he turned, glancing toward the wreckage of the mercenary's ship in the distance. Now we steal their ride. A slow, unexpected smile tugged at Rely's lips. She took his hand, and together they walked toward their future. The jungle air was thick with tension, the scent of damp earth and burned gunpowder clinging to the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a scavenger beast let out a deep, guttural cry, but Rely barely heard it over the pounding of her own heartbeat. The mercenary ship loomed ahead, a sleek, metallic predator hunched in the clearing, its hull marred with scratches and battle scars. The boarding ramp was still extended, left open from the previous fight. A way out, if they could reach it. Caden moved beside her, his grip steady on his stolen rifle. His face was set in stone, but she could feel the tension in him, the quiet calculation behind his eyes. He was already measuring the battlefield, picking his next move. "They'll have guards," he murmured. "The smart ones will be inside, covering the controls." Rely exhaled slowly, gripping her weapon tighter. "Then we'll have to be faster." He glanced at her, and for a brief moment, something softened in his expression. "Stay close." Then the first shot rang out. They dived for cover, throwing themselves behind a fallen tree as energy bolts ripped through the air. The ground sizzled where the blast struck, sending up small clouds of smoke. Shouts erupted from the ship. Orders barked, boots thudding against metal. The mercenaries were already repositioning. "We don't have time for a siege," Caden growled. "We need to move now." Rely scanned the battlefield. The ship had 2 gunners positioned on the ramp, their rifles trained on the jungle. A third mercenary was already flanking right, trying to cut them off. No hesitation. She lifted her weapon and fired. The flanking mercenary jerked back as the shot hit his side, stumbling before crumpling to the ground. Caden was already in motion, breaking from cover and charging forward. Rely followed, adrenaline screaming through her veins. No more running. No more waiting for death. A guard fired from the ramp. Caden ducked low, rolling beneath the spray of bullets before throwing his knife. The blade buried itself in the gunner's throat. The man collapsed, his weapon clattering uselessly down the ramp. Rely sprinted past him, her pulse a war drum in her ears. The second gunner swung his rifle toward her, but she was already too close. She slammed the butt of her weapon into his ribs, knocking him off balance. He staggered, gasping, just enough time for Caden to finish the job. Another shot, another body. The ramp was clear. They ran. The interior of the ship was dimly lit, its control panels glowing with soft neon light. The hum of the engine vibrated beneath her feet, alive, waiting. A figure moved in the cockpit. Rely barely had time to register the mercenary before the gun was already aimed at her chest. Caden shoved her aside, just as the shot fired. Pain exploded across his shoulder as the blast grazed him. No, Rely didn't think. She reacted. She ripped the fallen gun from the floor and fired straight into the cockpit. The mercenary slumped over the controls, dead. Silence. Caden leaned against the doorframe, teeth clenched in pain, blood seeping through his sleeve. Rely rushed to him, pressing a hand against his wound. "You're bleeding." Her voice shook. He let out a short breath, smirking despite the pain. "You should see the other guy." Rely's hands trembled against him. She had almost lost him. She didn't hesitate. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't rushed, wasn't frantic. It was real. A moment of certainty in the midst of chaos. Caden exhaled against her lips, his grip tightening around her waist. "We're getting better at this." A weak laugh escaped her. "Shut up." His forehead rested against hers for a heartbeat. Then his expression sharpened. "Get us out of here." Rely nodded, swallowing down the whirlwind of emotion. There would be time for that later. She turned to the controls, her fingers flying over the unfamiliar interface. The ship rumbled beneath them, the engine surging to life. Outside, more mercenaries were gathering. More shouts, more chaos. Too late. With a final punch of a button, Rely engaged the thrusters. The ship lifted off, its engines roaring as it tore free from the jungle floor. The mercenaries fired after them, but it didn't matter. They were free. The jungle shrank below them, the planet's dense canopy swallowed by distance. Rely let out a shaky breath, her hands still gripping the controls. Caden leaned against the co-pilot's seat, his eyes on her. "You did it. We did it," she almost said. Instead, she turned to him, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Where to, soldier?" Caden smirked. "Anywhere but here." And with that, they disappeared into the stars. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the ship's window, vast and silent. A swirling nebula glowed faintly in the distance, casting soft hues of violet and blue across the cold metal walls of the cabin. The hum of the ship's engine was the only sound, a steady rhythm beneath the weight of unspoken words. Rely stood by the window, her fingers trailing absently over the smooth surface of the glass. She had never seen the stars like this before, not from above. For so long, her world had been nothing but dense jungle and dark waters, a place where death lurked in every shadow. Now she was here, in space, alive, because of him. Behind her, Caden leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His wounds had mostly healed, but faint scars remained, marks of the battle they had survived together. Marks she had helped tend to, her hands lingering against his skin longer than necessary. Rely swallowed, her gaze flicking to his reflection in the glass. "You're staring." Caden smirked faintly, pushing off the doorframe. "You're the one standing there like a ghost." She exhaled through her nose, turning to face him. "I'm just not used to this. Any of this." She gestured vaguely around them, but they both knew she didn't just mean the ship. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "You regret it?" She shook her head. "No." A beat of silence. Then his voice dipped lower. "Good." The air between them felt heavier now, charged with something neither of them had dared to fully acknowledge. They had been running for so long, from death, from their pasts, from the way their bodies seemed to gravitate toward each other in quiet moments. But there was nowhere left to run now. Relai's breath caught as Caden reached out, fingers tracing lightly over the inside of her wrist. It was barely a touch, but set her entire body alight. He watched her, his gaze dark, searching. "Tell me to stop." She didn't. Instead, she stepped into him, closing the last of the distance between them. His breath hitched, his hands rising to her waist, tentative at first, as if giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. She didn't want to. Her fingers curled against his chest, feeling the slow, steady thrum of his heart beneath her palm. "You," Caden started, but she silenced him with a kiss. It wasn't soft. It was slow, deep, a claim more than a question. Caden let out a low sound, his hands tightening around her waist, pulling her closer. His body was solid against hers, warm despite the chill of the ship. Her fingers trailed upward, tracing along the scars on his shoulder, the one she had carefully bandaged nights ago. He shuddered under her touch. "Relai." His voice was hoarse, barely a breath. She kissed him again, tilting her head to deepen it. His control snapped. He pressed her against the cold metal wall, his mouth hungry, demanding, tracing along her jaw, down the curve of her throat. She arched into him, gasping softly as his teeth grazed her skin. Heat coiled low in her stomach, a slow-burning fire spreading through every inch of her. Caden's hands slid lower, over the curve of her hips, pulling her flush against him. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against her skin, his breath hot against her collarbone. She grabbed his face, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I don't want you to." Something broke between them. Caden lifted her, hands firm as he carried her toward the small cot against the wall. They fell together, tangled, desperate. His lips devoured hers, hands roaming, exploring, memorizing. Relai gasped as his mouth traveled lower, mapping a path down her skin, his fingers teasing, coaxing. She had never felt anything like this before, had never been touched like this before. Caden worshipped her. She cried out softly as he took his time, pulling sounds from her that she had never made before. Her fingers tangled in his hair, nails digging into his back as she breathed his name like a prayer. And when he finally claimed her fully, when their bodies moved together in a slow, aching rhythm, it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something undeniable. After, they lay tangled in the dim light, their breaths still uneven, bodies still humming from the aftermath. Relai traced lazy patterns across his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath her fingertips. Caden exhaled, his arm tightening around her, pulling her closer. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because for the first time in their lives, they were home.